Okay. We're moving on to another chapter on meiosis and genetics, but this first part is just kind of going over what we already know. So the cells of your body that do not give rise, that do give rise to sperm and eggs are called what? Anybody?
Somatic.
Huh?
Do give rise gametes?
Germ?
Gametes?
Well, those are gametes.
Or germlines?
Germaline, right. So there's somatic cells, and then there's germline cells that are actually hereditary. Okay. This is kind of a chart about how cancer starts. So you can have normal cells. Obviously, they replicate when they're supposed to and don't when they're not supposed to. There's unregulated replication, can lead to benign or invasive malignant cells because of, well, it'll move that. And then metastatic versus metastatic. So, cancer cells differ from normal cells. They divide when they shouldn't. Anything?
Cell cycle control?
Huh?
Cell cycle control?
Yeah. In terms of invading surrounding tissue, what is the loss of cause of that?
Contact inhibition?
Right. Move to other locations of the body. Not, you guys don't answer this one. Okay. Who else? What allows cells to migrate to other parts of the body?
Metastatic?
That's metastatic, that's moving, but what's the loss of that causes that?
The anchor's dependence.
Yes. Oh, look at that. See, it all has this on the bottom there. All you have to do is pick that.
Yep.
Good. Okay. So radiation therapy is least effective against tumors that have lost what? A, contact inhibition, anchorage dependence, or the ability to undergo apoptosis. Anybody? What do you think? Huh? That's metastatic. So, what does radiation therapy do to cells? It damages them. when there's a damaged cell, what usually stops it? Hmm? So it makes the cell commit suicide. Okay, so it's part of the tumor suppressor system. The cell is recognized as being strange, and then it turns the cell into a suicide machine.
I have a question about that.
Mm-hmm.
So is it the cell that's, well, you just said it like kills the cell, so it's the cell that's doing all the work, not other cells attacking?
No, it's actually the cells that that are damaged.
So what exactly, like, does it do?
Well, what happens is usually there's some protein or something that indicates there's something wrong with the cell. Then these immune cells actually do come along. They recognize that. They release some kind of biochemical that then induces the cell to kill itself. Okay, why is it good to take multiple biopsies from a single tumor? Because unregulated cell division leads to increased genetic diversity. Because a given drug may be effective against only one part of the tumor, because tumor evolution can occur, or, oh, not C, D. All of these are true. Anybody? Yeah. Every single one of these is true. Biopsies, cells, as part of their, cancer cells as part of their unreplicated, their replicated, uncontrolled replication, generate mutations. And so there's a lot of genetic diversity because of that. So you might actually get, if you do a biopsy in one place, you might only get some of those mutations showing up and not all of them. The same thing if you only do a biopsy in one place. You find that there's certain mutations, you use a drug that works against those mutations, and it turns out, okay, I think we're done. But anyway, it's all of these. Okay. Anybody do anything fun this weekend? Okay. Bunch of deadbeats. Anybody? Nothing? What'd you do?
Went to Six Flags.
Huh?
Went to Six Flags.
Six Flags.
Went to my high school and helped with their drama department.
Oh, good. Good. So you help people make fools of themselves, right? Yeah? Good.
It's fun.
Excellent. Let's see.
Quite sad.
Anybody know where Carrizo Plain is? Over the Grapevine, off of Highway 5, kind of right up against the mountains there. There's this big plain, the San Andreas Fault goes right through it. Anyway, right now, there's a spectacular wildflower bloom. I went there. It was pretty, maybe I'll put up a couple of photos. But anyway, it was pretty nice, I have to admit. Okay, we're kind of still reviewing a little bit, and then we'll go on to the next stuff. But cell cycle, of course, G1, that's where most cells spend most of their time. DNA replication is the S phase. So once it's going to replicate, you have to double the amount of DNA. Then you got more growth for the G2 phase, and then
the mitotic phases, which includes prophase, metaphase, anaphase, teleophase, and then cytokinesis is where you have two daughter cells. Are these daughter cells, are they 2N or 1N? In other words, are they diploid or haploid? Huh? Diploid, yes. Absolutely, good. Yeah. So when we get to meiosis, we're going to be producing haploid sperm cells and egg cells. But right now we're just talking about cell replication, kind of everyday sort of stuff. Okay. Now, mitosis for single cell organisms, for the most part, they can replicate through mitosis. They don't have to go through the whole making sperm. They don't use sexual reproduction. So up on the left is a bacteria that's splitting in two. I'm not sure what kind of cell that is on the right. These are planaria. That's actually, they're multicellular, but they can still split in two. In fact, you can chop these things up and they'll grow into new planaria, a whole bunch of them. I think this is a parasite, Giardia, that intestinal parasite. So, when you have asexual reproduction using mitosis, you've got clones. You're making clones of the originals. They've got the exact same DNA, the exact same alleles, unless there's a mutation. Okay. The cells in your body that do give rise to sperm and eggs are called what? Huh? That's the other one. Germline, right. That's good. Good thinking. So, okay. And what are the ones that don't give rise? Somatic. Right? So, or autosomes. Now, okay. So this is the karyotype of our DNA. We've got 22 autosomes, and then we've got 2 6 chromosomes. Okay, either an X or a Y. Females are XX, males are XY. Now, our somatic cells are diploid. They have 2 of each chromosome. One copy is from mom, one copy is from dad. Each pair is a homologous chromosome. In other words, they've got the same exact gene loci on the chromosome as the other one. They might have different alleles, but it's still the same chromosomes. I mean, the same genes on the chromosome. Okay. This is homologous pair of chromosomes. One from mom, one from dad. Each one of these by itself is a chromatid. We'll say that one's from mom, and this one's from dad. Okay. These are homologous. That means they've got the same loci, as I've been saying. Now, in this case, they've got different alleles. So at loci A, you've got a big allele A and a little allele A. So they're heterozygotes. At B, they're identical. They're homozygotes, large B. And then at C, large C, small c. Okay? So you've got two alleles of the same gene. Now, these are non-homologous chromosomes, just so you know. So they don't come in this kind of a configuration. They always come in this kind of configuration, a homologous pair. So the karyotype displays the chromosomes. You can only see these when they start condensing during prophase. Can this be obtained from a cell at any stage of the cell cycle? So no. Okay, vocabulary. Diploid, that means you've got a cell with homologous pairs of chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad. So those are diploid. You can see that from the karyotype. Each chromosome, there's two of them. Now, human somatic cells, or autosomes, there's a total of 23 chromosomes, pairs of chromosomes, that's 46 total. 22 are autosomes or somatic cells, and then 2 are sex chromosomes. The sex chromosomes are the only ones that differ in terms of the genes or loci on them. All the other ones have exactly the same genes. Okay. Now, eggs and sperm have one of each chromosome. These cells are called haploid. So they don't have, like these homologous pairs up here, all they have are the lonely ones. If it's from a dad, then it's a sperm, and you can have many, many different combinations. Now, and we'll get into that exactly what I mean by that. But, so there's 23 chromosomes, and there's actually 23 pairs for a diploid cell, 23 single chromosomes for a haploid cell. So when you have a sperm and egg come together, they restore the diploid state. So if you have a sperm with 23 chromosomes, and you have an egg with 23 chromosomes, when the sperm fertilizes the egg, you now have 23 pairs or 46 chromosomes. Okay, so meiosis, has anybody started on the next symbio on meiosis? Okay. You might want to start playing around with it. But meiosis occurs only within the germline. Okay, meiosis only happens for sexual reproduction. That's it. When you have a mutation in the germ line, that can be passed on from parents to offspring. When you have a mutation in the somatic cells, that doesn't go any further in terms of generations. So only germline cells that happen to have let's say a bad mutation, that's going to be passed on to your offspring. The other ones won't. Okay, and then as I said, fertilization restores the diploid number of chromosomes. So a sperm has 23, an egg has 23. Those 23 have the same genes, each one, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you end up with a zygote with 23 pairs, one from mom, one from dad. Okay. Meiosis starts like mitosis. So once you get to the mitotic phase, you've got these chromosomes that have been duplicated, and you have prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, right? And so you've got the replicated DNA, and then it ends like mitosis, in that you have a separation of the sister chromatids. So when you have diploid, you have one sister chromatid and the other sister chromatid. So here's the cell cycle again. This is mitosis on the left. And then here is a look at meiosis. Okay. So during prophase 1, that's during meiosis 1, there's two parts to meiosis, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. Prophase 1, the chromosomes condense. As they do over in mitosis. Right? Okay. Now, the difference is, in meiosis, tetrads, that means these two make a tetrad, right? Form of the homologous pairs of chromosomes. Then at metaphase, everything lines up along the metaphase plate, but tetrads align on the metaphase plate. Okay. Now, during anaphase, for mitosis, the chromosomes separate to either pole. So each pole has a complete copy of the whole genome. And anaphase 1 and telophase 1, the same thing happens. And then in meiosis 2, you have a further separation. They go through the same cycle, but now we're going to end up with haploid chromosomes. This is gamete formation. So if it's a male, it has sperm. Female had eggs. So the daughter cells of meiosis 2 are N versus the diploid. You always deal with 2N, okay? So 2N means that there's two copies of each chromosome, one N means there's one copy of a chromosome. So there's a special cell division inserted in between the mitosis parts where you have an alignment and separation of these homologous extra chromosomes. Okay? Which is going to be in here. Oh, no, that's what it is. Yeah, so it's in meiosis 1. And then, okay. So meiosis occurs in germline cells or somatic cells? Which one? Okay. And produces haploid or diploid gametes. Haploid or diploid? Huh? Haploid. Okay. So germline, this is meiosis, you're going to end up with haploid cells, either sperm or eggs. Those are gametes. And there's always haploid or diploid. There's always haploid. The fertilized egg is called, anybody remember? Starts with a Z? Zygote. Okay. And that zygote, is it haploid or diploid? Diploid. So germline, these are gametes, and they're always haploid. Or the germline cells make gametes that are haploid. Sorry. So the germline cells are diploid, but they produce haploid gametes. And then the fertilized egg, a zygote, is the restored diploid from two gametes meeting and fertilizing. So, any reasons for why there might be sex? Anybody? How about it just feels good? Right? I mean, that's a good enough reason, don't you think? Okay, so that's all I really want to say about sex. Nah. Okay, we're going to go into this a little bit more in detail, but sexual reproduction is actually expensive. In fact, asexual reproduction, where you don't need two different sexes, has higher fitness. And I'll show you what I mean.
Fitness, like the babies come out, like strong.
Well, let's look at it. Okay? Okay. Okay. You have 10 asexual. That means each one, we're going to say, just can have one offspring. It duplicates itself. So you end up with 10 offspring. Um, Okay. You get the idea. So you'll have 10 offspring. Now, with sexual reproduction, you have 5 offspring. Okay? If each generation, one group can produce 10 offspring, the other produces 5, which has a higher fitness? The asexual reproduction. In other words, sexual reproduction has an inherent twofold cost. So why is there so much sex besides it feeling so good? Why? Any ideas? What might you get with sexual reproduction that you don't remember? Asexual, you get an exact copy, a clone. What, do you get the same sort of thing with sexual reproduction? No. So, with sexual reproduction, you get greater diversity in terms of the alleles that the offspring actually has. And also, natural selection can happen, has a much bigger effect with sexual reproduction than asexual reproduction. So, when you have a homologous pair of chromosomes, one of those chromosomes is going to end up in a gamete. Let's say the one on the left is from mom and the one on the right is from dad, okay? Which one does the offspring get? I mean, does the, let's say, sperm or egg get? Well, it's random. Depends on where they line up on the metaphase plate during meiosis 2, and as they split apart, some are going to get mom's chromosomes, some are going to get dad's. In fact, they're going to get a mix because we've got 23 pairs. So, which one you get depends. It's just completely random. It's like flipping a coin. So that's one way you get genetic diversity. So this is when they separate into single chromosomes for each gamete. For humans, 23 single chromosomes. you can have an independent assortment. That means which one you get is 2 to the 23 chromosomes. 23 is like 2 squared, 2 to 2, 2 triple, 2 to the 3, well, 2 to the 23. That's a huge number of different combinations, like 8 million types of gametes. Okay, so you can get a huge number of genetic combinations there. Now, because there's also random fertilization, in other words, which gamete gets to the egg, right? Well, you can actually have 64 trillion individual zygotes, okay, in terms of the genes and the alleles they have. No two will be exactly identical. So you're really scrambling the alleles inside a gamete. And the same thing happens with an egg, right? You have 8 million combinations for that as well. 8 times 8 is 64, so you got 64 trillion. Stop it. Okay. My cells, they do things on their own. I don't like it. They do that. Okay. So, each child is a unique combination of parental traits. Except for identical twins. We'll get to that. Right now. So when you have identical twins, it means that you have one embryo that somehow then separates into 2. But there was only originally one embryo. In other words, one zygote. So those 2 individuals have inherited exactly the same genes as the other. And that's often why they look very similar and act very similar. Now, dizygotic twins, those are fraternal twins. They are no more genetically identical than brother or sister. In other words, like a brother or a sister or 2 brothers, they share 50% of their alleles. Okay? Whereas with a monozygotic twin, they are each 100% related to each other. So, once upon a time, there was this couple. They lived in Sioux City, Nebraska. They're named the Johnsons. And lo and behold, they had identical twins, 2 baby boys. One was named Sean, and the other was named Dawn. Sean and Dawn. Okay, they were identical. Now, it turns out growing up in Sioux City, Nebraska, they hadn't really traveled much. They'd once gone up to Yellowstone National Park, not that far away, but they really hadn't traveled much. And the grandparents decided to send the whole family, not them, just the parents and the 2 boys, on a cruise around the world. So off they go. first they started out, they flew down to Miami, then they cruised around the Caribbean. The food, anybody been on a cruise before? There's a lot of food, isn't there? Yeah. It's good food? Okay. We'll say it's really good food. I'm sorry if you went on a bum cruise.
No, it was good.
Was it?
Yeah, they
Okay.
had like a buffet and then they
Yeah.
had like the restaurant where you make reservations.
Right, okay. So, anyway, they started eating and eating and eating. They, a storm came up and they got big waves, and of course, all that eating didn't come out so good. If you can imagine. They started spewing. And once the storm went away, things settled down. They were happy to land, spent some time on an island. They went to Jamaica. Unfortunately, there's a lot of crime on Jamaica. So they were out wandering around, and this Rastafarian came out with a knife and said, "Give me everything." So they got robbed as well. This trip was not really starting out the way you would want, right? So finally they head across the Atlantic, around the Horn of Africa, around the tip of Africa, and then up towards the Horn of Africa where Somalia is. And they're cruising along, and what happens? Well, they're out, this cruise, it has a couple of pools, so they're out by the pool. Little kids are in the pool, peeing in the pool like little kids do. They're both out there with their kids, Mom and Pop and Sean and Dawn. And suddenly, Mom and Dawn, he gets a little fussy, and so Mom is thinking, I'll take Dawn up for a little nap. Sean is having a grand old time. So even though they're identical, they're not completely, one's tired and one isn't. So Mom and Dawn go up to the cabin and the stateroom, whatever. The other one stays down there. And about 15 minutes later, they're boarded by Somali pirates. Well, all hell breaks loose, as you can imagine. These are not the kind of pirates we all love, like har matey, right? With cutlasses and all that. No, these are Somali pirates with AK-47s and grenade launchers. And what they do is they collect everybody's collectibles, and then they separate the kids. And Sean's father runs over and they shoot him and he's dead. Poor guy. And it turns out the Somali pirates kidnap the kids and sell them on the slave market into Chad and Niger, these African places where there's still actually slavery. So now Sean, they never recover him. Dad is dead. He grows up as a slave in Niger with Tuareg tribesmen. As you can imagine, he's not well treated. The food there is not very good. He grows to 5'10", and maybe 150 pounds. His diet isn't all that great. Well, in the meantime, the mom and Dawn, they return to Nebraska with a money-back guarantee. A lot of help that does. Dad's dead. And Dawn grows up into a 250-pound, 6'3" beefcake, middle linebacker. Okay? He's a high school All-American. Now, remember, they're identical twins, but height is about, and size is about 80% heritable. So, there we do. We have these two kids that are identical, but one's 5'10", 150, and the other's 6'3" and 250. Okay? Well, Don, he's being recruited by, the University of Nebraska and all that, but he decides to join the Army, the Marines. So, he joins the Marines. He's deployed to Africa. In fact, they're going to finally wipe out all these Somali pirates. And there's been these reports, of all these kids that have been kidnapped and turned into slaves. So they're off gallivanting around, and they come to an area where there's a bunch of slaves. This is like later now, so it's like 15 years later, 16 years later, right? And there's this kid who looks surprisingly like Don, except that he's a lot shorter and not as big. Now, this whole time, while this was happening, he never remembered the pirates because he was fast asleep, right? But he still, from then on, dreamed of going to sea, which he did as a Marine. So it turns out that, in fact, that's his long-lost brother. Now, they're identical twins. They each have identical genes. If one were to have an offspring, its relative fitness, we'll say, would be 1. What would the fitness of the twin be? Not the original one, but the twin, in terms of offspring. What would you say? 0? He doesn't have any kids, right? The other one does. But actually, they would have identical fitness, because they're identical in terms of genes, and if one has offspring, the other one has offspring. In fact, if one of the twins had died at childbirth, he still would have had fitness of 1. Okay, so I just wanted you to understand about monozygotic twins. Now, the reason they look so different is something called phenotypic plasticity. And Sean, the shorter one, can actually get by now on a lot less food. He's not as tall and big. He doesn't need as many calories as his brother. And he's brought back to the United States with his wife. He's got a wife. Her name is Sasha. It sounds like Sasha in Tuareg. And surprisingly, Don's got a girlfriend, and her name is Sasha as well. It's weird how monozygotic twins, things like that happen. Then there's a massive famine in the United States. Which one would actually survive better? The big one or the little one? That's right. So that's what happens. The big one, Don, even though he's an All-American and he's going to go play in the NFL, he's dead. The short one survives. But even though he dies, the short one then has, let's say, 5 kids. So the one that dies actually has equal amount of fitness. Okay? Anyway. So there's a difference between dizygotic and monozygotic. That's why if you're, let's say, if you've got your kids, remember you're half related, but to yourself you're 100% related. So if there's danger, you just have to say, sorry kids, you're only half related, and they're dead, and then you go on, and you can always have more offspring, right? Isn't that how it works? I guess not. You guys don't seem to be, think that's, well, never mind. So, anyway, so here's a question. This is a roundworm. It produces sperm, which it stores. It also produces eggs. So this is what's called a hermaphrodite. Okay? It's got both sperm and eggs. And normally what will happen is two different worms might get together and one will donate sperm and the other will donate sperm back, and they'll have the eggs, right? And so they'll be hermaphrodites. They'll both have offspring, but it's still sexual reproduction. I just want you to understand that. Okay. Okay, so fertilization produces a zygote. And then what happens after that? You've got a single-celled fertilized egg. It starts undergoing meiosis. So it was formed by two meiotic cells during sex, and it ends up with a diploid, and that starts undergoing mitotic division, so that eventually you, with the right program, you end up with, let's say, a human being. And as there's this division going on, some of the cells become germline cells, and all the other cells become somatic cells. Okay. Your somatic cells have two of each chromosome. They are haploid or diploid? What do you think? Diploid. Remember, you are diploid. Now, you might be different than the rest of us. You might actually be haploid, but I don't think so. So your somatic cells have two copies, okay? One from mom, one from dad. Originally, you were a zygote. We were all, once upon a time, a single-celled fertilized egg. That egg is diploid. Okay. And what are these pairs of chromosomes called? Right. So the specialized form of cell division that occurs in your germline is called mitosis or meiosis. I heard meiosis. The gametes have one of each chromosome, and they're so what are they? Haploid or diploid? Okay. Okay. For now, we'll say that the genome is an instruction manual, but it's not really. Just because you have a genome doesn't mean you're going to get a functioning organism, because it's actually a combination of genes and environment. Okay? But for now, we'll say the egg has 23 pages of instructions, one for each chromosome. The sperm has, and then when they come together, they've got 46. Okay. Now, okay. So here's the hemoglobin gene. The hemoglobin is in our blood. It's got iron is part of it, and it's got a high affinity for oxygen, right? So when you breathe in, the red blood cells take up the oxygen. When they get to the cells that need oxygen have higher affinity for oxygen. They take it, and in return, CO2 latches on to the hemoglobin. It's taken back out to the lungs where it's breathed out. Okay? Now, that's normal hemoglobin. And we'll say the allele for normal hemoglobin is HbA. Okay? However, at this codon in the hemoglobin, you've got GAG. And GAG codes for leucine. Or I think glutamine or something like that. Sometimes someone has a different allele. It's a GTG instead of a GAG. And that codes for the amino acid valine. Now, when you have an HbA allele and an HbS allele, this is a heterozygote, and their blood cells are protected against malaria parasite. Whereas if you're in an area of malaria and you have the normal type, HbA, then you're not. And then, unfortunately, if you have HbS, you have, you're a homozygote for a recessive lethal, and this is someone who has sickle cell anemia. Okay, so you can be a sickle cell carrier if you have an HbA and an HbS. You can have an HbA, which means you're susceptible to malaria, and then you can have HbS, which means you're probably going to die before you reach 10 or 15 years old. So, this is sickle cell anemia. So, when you have an HbA, one of each allele, HbA, HbS, that's a heterozygote. Hetero means different. So, what we have is an individual that has two alleles. Remember, one from mom, one from dad, but one's a normal allele, one's a sickle cell allele. And they are resistant to malaria. Unfortunately, they also have a little bit of sickling, so they don't carry oxygen as well as a normal type. But when there's a lot of malaria in a place that's endemic with malaria, they survive and no one else really does. And then you have two homozygous alleles. They're the same alleles. And a homozygote is either HBA-HBA or HBS-HBS. The normal type is HBA-HBA, have normal hemoglobin. The other, HBS-HBS, they have sickle cell anemia. It's anemia because their cells don't carry oxygen very well. And also they change shape and gum up the works. So, we talked about this a long time ago. Genotype and phenotype. So, for our purposes, we'll say if you're HBA genotype, you have normal red blood cells. If you have HBS, it means you have sickle cell. That means your fitness is pretty worthless. But if you're HBS, you have somewhat normal blood cells, but you're resistant to the malaria parasite. Oh, yeah, now we're back with him, aren't we? Okay, so I just want you to remember that. Homozygote means the individual has the same alleles, one on each of the homologous chromosomes. Heterozygote means they have two different types of alleles. Okay? Now, in this case, it's the alleles, one of them is deleterious, it's bad, when it's paired with another deleterious allele. So you can have a recessive, let's say HBA, or let's say allele A and allele B, and you can have someone who's BB, and they're fine, they just have a different allele and a different phenotype. So, a genotype, those are the alleles that you actually have. And the phenotype is the trait that results from those genotypes. So, in this case, the genotype for normal is HBA, and you have normal blood cells. That's the phenotype. HBS, somewhat normal, but still good enough to carry oxygen. But you're resistant to malaria, parasite. And then HBS, you pay a big price. In other words, you're unlikely to ever breed successfully. You'll die first. Okay. Now, if you're a heterozygote, would a heterozygote be like HBA, or would it be HBS? Okay, HBA. Okay. That's the heterozygote. In other words, this one, if they mate with someone else, they're a carrier. 50% of the time, they're going to donate a normal HBA allele. And 50% of the time, they're going to donate to the offspring an HBS allele. Okay? Okay, dominant and recessive. Okay. Now, instead of HBA and HBS, we're just going to have allele A1 and allele A2. Now, in terms of dominance and recessive, we're going to say that A1 is dominant over A2. That means an individual with even one copy of A1 or two copies is going to express the dominant phenotype. Kind of like those with HBA, HBA, or HBA, HBS have basically normal red blood cells. Okay? So, in that case, HBA, the normal type, is dominant. The only time that the recessive genotype ends up with a recessive phenotype is if you have two copies. So, the dominant phenotype, it's either the A1A1, homozygous dominant, or A1A2, heterozygous, but they still have one copy of A1, they still express the dominant phenotype. A phenotype that is only expressed when there's a homozygote, recessive homozygote, in this case A2, you'll end up with a homozygous recessive, and that's only going to be expressed when you have two of those alleles. Now, I mentioned HBS. That's the recessive. Those individuals have sickle cell anemia. But having a recessive allele is not associated with disease. Okay? You might think that everything recessive is a disease. No. It's just a different allele. So, let's say in terms of eye color, you have one eye color, brown, that's for the most part dominant compared to blue. It's only you have two copies of the blue allele that you'll actually show blue eyes. Otherwise, it's going to be covered up with brown. Now, another thing in terms of the allele is you can have a dominant, and it has nothing to do with whether it's common or rare. You can have a dominant or a rare allele, a recessive allele that only shows up when there's a pair of those alleles, but that might be the most common phenotype. Okay? And the dominant might be rare. So I'll give you an example. There's a genetic disease called Huntington's chorea. There's an enzyme that's not made, and it doesn't break down this other protein, and so the individual who inherits this, it's a dominant allele, it's a dominant phenotype. You only need one copy, but they start showing neurological problems that eventually kills them. It usually shows up in middle age, 30, 35, 40, and then the individual who has Huntington's chorea, within a couple of years, they're usually dead. Now, in this case, it's a dominant allele. If you get one copy from either parent, you are going to get it. And you're going to express it, and you're going to have neurological problems. And you'll know it, first of all, because whoever you got the allele from, whether your mom or your dad, they're going to have those neurological problems before you do. Okay? So in other words, you'll know what your fate is if you get genotyped and you would actually inherit the allele. But that's a dominant. It's a rare dominant. It's not very common in the general population, but if you get it, it means that you've kind of won or lost the lottery. Okay? So, being dominant has nothing to do with being common or rare. It just has to do with how it's expressed. Phenotype, so a phenotype is anatomy, physiology, behavior, development. That's the phenotype. The genotype is what alleles you have in combination. So for every gene, we're going to have 2 alleles. Sometimes they'll be the same allele, sometimes they'll be different. Homozygous or heterozygous. And there can be dominance or recessiveness. Can anybody do a tongue rolling? Yeah, okay. You're dominant. You're better than everybody. Anybody else can do it? Okay. Okay, you and, I think, should you mate? No, never mind. He can do it too, so your kids, well, actually, either one, they're going to be able to do it. Okay? So it doesn't matter. Now, detached earlobes. I have to say that means I'm dominant. It's a dominant trait. Okay? And whereas attached earlobes is actually a recessive trait where you need 2 alleles for that. Hitchhiker's thumb. Right, exactly. So you can see there's all kinds of dominant and recessive traits. Now, these are all monogenetic traits. That means there's only one gene controlling them and expressing them. Just so you know, most traits are the result of many, many genes interacting with each other. Like height, there's a whole bunch of genes that affect height, and each one adds a little bit to the effect. Okay? So, it's not like you have one gene for height, and if you get one from mom, and her family is generally bigger than dad's, then you might be tall. It doesn't work that way. There's many that's called polygenic. Okay, so here we are back with meiosis and with sickle cell. So, if you're heterozygote for this, that means half your gametes will have HBA and half will have HBS. So here's 2 sperm. One, you would look at them, they look pretty much identical, but one would be a mutant. Okay, if you remember about the STRs, the same sort of thing can happen. There's 4 possible outcomes here. Let's see. So, those are the 4 outcomes. Same thing with 2 alleles. Okay. So here. So if 2 HBA, HBS heterozygotes marry, given that HBS is recessive, what's the probability that their child will have sickle cell anemia? To actually have sickle cell anemia, you need 2 HBSs. Okay. So how would you figure this out? Well, you'd make something called a Punnett square. we'll say the man is there, the woman is there. So the man is along the top, the woman is this. And if they're both heterozygotes, we'll say the man is HBA. Oh. Oh, that's all we want there, right? Okay. So we want HBA, and we also want so he's got two alleles, right? He's got an HBA and an HBS. And then we're going to do the same thing with the mom. Okay, that's good. Oh, it's time. Okay. What? Yeah. Okay, so we'll pick up here and see how to figure these out, because these are going to be on the exam to do this.
We have so much practice. We have so much practice for this too. How stereotypes affect identity. I was like, stereotypes. Yeah.